Prepare to delve into a tale that defies reason and reveals the darkest side of human nature. Today we'll explore together one of the most disturbing mysteries the Kentucky Appalachians have ever witnessed. Before we begin, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from now. Is anyone near the mountains we'll be discussing today? It was the year 1918. World War I still echoed through the valleys and mountains of the United States, and while soldiers fought overseas, life in the isolated regions of Kentucky followed its own slow, silent rhythm. The Appalachians had always been a land of wild beauty and ancient secrets. Its dense forests, winding trails, and tight-knit communities held stories that rarely made it into the big city newspapers. But what happened that cold autumn would forever change the way the residents of Harlan County viewed their own land. Rebecca Crowe was a well-known woman in the small community of Cumberland Gap, a village nestled among the mountains, where everyone knew everyone else and strangers were greeted with suspicion. Rebecca was 32 years old, a widow for 4 years after her husband died in an accident in the coal mines that sustained the local economy. She lived alone in a wooden cabin on the outskirts of town, about 2 miles from the center, where she raised chickens and maintained a small vegetable garden. She was a reserved woman, a man of few words, but respected for her skill with medicinal herbs. Many sought her out when they were sick, and Rebecca always treated them kindly, though she never charged more than a loaf of bread or a few eggs. October of 1918 brought an early cold snap to the mountains. Trees lost their leaves rapidly, and thick fog blanketed the valleys at dawn. It was in this gloomy atmosphere that Rebecca began to act strangely. Neighbors reported that she seemed anxious, constantly glancing into the woods as if waiting for someone or something. On a visit to the local grocery store, she reportedly told the owner, a man named Thomas Wiggins, that she felt something bad was about to happen. Thomas didn't pay much attention. After all, these were difficult times, and everyone carried some kind of fear. On October 23rd, Rebecca didn't show up at church, something unusual for her. Her absence drew attention because Rebecca never missed Sunday services. The next day, a neighbor, Martha Hayes, went to Rebecca's cabin to check on her. The door was ajar. Martha entered, calling Rebecca's name, but received no answer. The house was in disarray, something completely out of character for Rebecca, who always kept everything organized. Pots and pans were on the floor, the table was overturned, and there were clear signs that something violent had occurred. Martha rushed back to the village and alerted the county sheriff, a man named Samuel Dockery, who had held the position for 12 years. Samuel gathered some men and headed to the cabin. What they found inside confirmed their worst fears. There were signs of a struggle, broken objects and disturbing evidence that could not be ignored. But Rebecca Crowe was gone. There was no body, no clear trace of where she might have gone. Only this chaotic scene and a sense of dread that hung in the air. The sheriff immediately began a search. Men from the village followed familiar trails, scoured the surrounding forest, and investigated paths leading to other communities. For 3 days, nothing was found. No tracks, no scraps of clothing, no concrete clues. It was as if Rebecca had been swallowed by the mountain itself. People began to talk. Rumors spread quickly. Some said Rebecca had run away, perhaps with some unknown man. Others, more superstitious, spoke of ancient curses, of spirits that inhabited the Appalachian forests. But Sheriff Samuel Dockery wasn't one to believe stories. He knew something real, something tangible had happened in that cabin, and he was determined to find out what. The problem was that in the Appalachians of 1918, the law had limited reach. There was no forensic technology, no specialized teams. Everything depended on witnesses, confessions, and luck. And in this particular case, luck seemed to have completely abandoned the investigation. Then, on the 4th day of searching, a young hunter named William Porter made a discovery that would change everything. William was stalking a deer deep in the woods, about 5 miles from Rebecca's cabin, when he stumbled upon something partially buried under leaves and branches. It was a personal item, something that unmistakably belonged to Rebecca Crowe. William's heart raced. He looked around and realized he was in an area rarely visited, a patch of dense forest where sunlight barely penetrated, and it was there, in that forgotten, shadowy place, that the secrets began to emerge. William Porter rushed back to Cumberland Gap, clutching the object as if it were sacred evidence. His hands trembled as he handed the discovery to Sheriff Samuel Dockery. It was a silver brooch, simple but unmistakable, the one Rebecca always wore pinned to her shawl. Everyone in the village recognized it immediately. Martha Hayes confirmed that Rebecca never left home without the adornment, a memento of her late mother. The sheriff knew he finally had a clear path. If the brooch was 5 miles away, Rebecca had been taken far from her cabin, possibly against her will. Samuel organized a new expedition, this time larger and more systematic. 15 men volunteered, including William Porter, who knew the exact location of the discovery. They set out at dawn on October 28th, armed with lanterns, ropes, and tools. The path to this part of the forest was steep and treacherous. The trees grew so densely that they formed a dark green canopy overhead. The silence was profound, broken only by the creaking of branches underfoot and the distant call of a solitary bird. When they reached the spot where William had found the brooch, the sheriff ordered the men to spread out in concentric circles, searching every inch of ground. The morning mist hadn't yet completely dissipated, and the atmosphere made everything even more unsettling. It was then that one of the men, a farmer named Jacob Mullins, shouted for everyone to come closer. He had found something buried shallowly under a pile of leaves and disturbed earth. The group gathered around, and what they saw confirmed their worst fears since the beginning of their search. There, in that hidden clearing, lay the remains of Rebecca Crowe. The body had been partially covered, as if someone had hurriedly but carelessly tried to hide it. Sheriff Samuel immediately cordoned off the area and asked that no one touch anything. He examined the area carefully, searching for any clues that might indicate who had committed the act. There were marks on the ground around it, as if something heavy had been dragged. Footprints, partially erased by the recent rain, were still visible in some patches of mud. The body was transported back to Cumberland Gap with the utmost care. The only physician in the area, Dr. Henry Caldwell, was called in to perform an examination. Henry was 56 years old and had served the entire Appalachian region for over 2 decades. He had seen a lot over the years, but even for him, this case carried a different weight. After hours of analysis, Henry prepared a preliminary report for the sheriff. The conclusions were disturbing. Rebecca had been the victim of extreme violence. The marks indicated a fierce struggle, and everything pointed to a deliberate and brutal attack. The news spread through the village like wildfire. Fear gripped Cumberland Gap. If something like this could happen to Rebecca, a respected and peaceful woman, then no one was safe. Families began locking their doors early. Men began patrolling the neighborhood at night, and women avoided going out alone. Sheriff Samuel felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. He needed to find whoever was responsible, and quickly, before the panic escalated into something even worse. The investigation intensified. Samuel began questioning everyone who had had contact with Rebecca in the weeks before her disappearance. The list was short, as Rebecca had few connections. There was the grocer, Thomas Wiggins, who confirmed the strange talk about bad feelings. There was Martha Hayes, the neighbor, who swore she hadn't seen anything suspicious. And there were a few other residents who occasionally traded goods with Rebecca or solicited her herbalist's expertise. But then a name emerged that no one had mentioned before. During one of the interviews, Martha Hayes remembered a detail that seemed irrelevant at the time. About 2 weeks before the disappearance, Rebecca had mentioned to her a strange man who had appeared on her property. Rebecca said the man claimed to be passing through, coming from somewhere in the mountains farther north, and asked for water and a place to rest. Rebecca, ever charitable, offered what he asked. But Martha remembered Rebecca saying the man had made her uncomfortable. There was something in his eyes, something in the way he spoke that didn't seem right. Sheriff Samuel immediately saw this as a crucial clue. Who was this man? Where had he come from? Where had he gone after leaving Rebecca's property? Samuel began investigating travelers and strangers who had passed through the area during those weeks. In a small community like Cumberland Gap, strangers were always noticed. He spoke with owners of modest inns nearby, with stable owners where travelers might have left horses, with merchants who served out-of-towners. And so, through small fragments of information, Samuel began to piece together a profile. Several people mentioned a tall man with a dark beard and worn clothes who had been seen wandering the area in early October. He didn't stay in a fixed place, sleeping outdoors or in abandoned barns. He didn't say much, paid with old coins, and disappeared before anyone could ask too many questions. A merchant in a neighboring village, located 15 kilometers from Cumberland Gap, remembered selling provisions to someone matching that description on October 20th, just 3 days before Rebecca disappeared. The investigation was taking shape, but it also raised more questions. Who was this mysterious man? Was he really responsible for what happened to Rebecca Crowe? And if so, where was he now? Sheriff Samuel Dockery knew he was racing against time. With each passing day, the trail grew colder, and the chances of finding answers diminished. Sheriff Samuel Dockery was not a man to give up easily. He had sworn to protect this community, and Rebecca Crowe's death weighed heavily on his conscience. He decided to expand the investigation beyond Harlan County. He sent telegrams to sheriffs in neighboring counties, describing the mysterious man and asking them to be on the lookout for anyone matching that description. In the Appalachians of 1918, communication between authorities was slow and precarious, but it was all Samuel had at his disposal. While waiting for answers, the sheriff decided to revisit Rebecca's cabin. Perhaps there was something they'd missed on their initial inspection. He brought along young William Porter, whose keen hunter's eye could spot details others wouldn't. They arrived at the property in the early afternoon of a grey day. The cabin remained exactly as it had been left after the initial discovery, silent and abandoned. Rebecca's chickens had either escaped or been taken by predators. The vegetable garden was beginning to wither with the arrival of winter. Inside the house, Samuel and William examined every corner with methodical patience. They rummaged through drawers, looked under the bed, and rummaged through the small trunk where Rebecca kept her few clothes. It was William who found something interesting. Beneath a loose floorboard was a small space where Rebecca hid some valuable belongings: old letters from her late husband, a few stashed coins, and a worn leather-bound diary. Samuel's heart raced. A diary could contain crucial information. They sat at the kitchen table, and Samuel began to leaf through the pages. Rebecca's handwriting was delicate but firm. The first entries were several years old, simple accounts of daily life, memories of her husband, prescriptions. But as I moved on to the more recent pages, the tone changed. Rebecca had begun to record concerns, strange sensations. In an entry from October 5th, she wrote about the man who had appeared on her property. She described him as rough-looking, with hands calloused from hard work and eyes that seemed to carry deep shadows. She wrote that he offered hospitality, but that something about him unsettled her. Later, on October 12th, Rebecca made another disturbing note. The man had returned. He appeared again, this time claiming he needed help with a wound on his hand. Rebecca, by her compassionate nature, treated the wound with her herbs, but she noted that the entire time she was caring for him, the man kept looking around the house as if assessing, calculating. Rebecca wrote that she felt afraid but didn't want to show it. When the man left, she locked all the doors and windows, something she rarely did. The last entry in the diary was dated October 22nd, the day before Rebecca disappeared. The handwriting was shaky, hurried. Rebecca wrote that she was certain someone was watching her. Several times during that week, she had noticed strange movements in the woods surrounding her property. Shadows among the trees, the sound of branches breaking when there was no wind. She considered contacting the sheriff, but was afraid of appearing paranoid. After all, it was wartime, and everyone was on edge. The last sentence Rebecca wrote was chilling. It simply said, "If anything happens to me, the shadow man will know why." Samuel closed the diary slowly. Now he was certain. The mysterious man wasn't just a passing traveler. He had returned, had watched Rebecca, and was likely responsible for her death. But what had motivated him? Robbery seemed unlikely, as Rebecca had very little of value. Was it something personal, some unhealthy obsession, or simply the action of someone disturbed, for no apparent reason? The sheriff and William returned to Cumberland Gap with the diary. Samuel called a meeting of the village's most trusted men. He read to them selected excerpts from Rebecca's notes. The revelation sparked outrage and a renewed desire for justice. Everyone there knew Rebecca, respected her kindness, and now knew she had sensed her own fate, had tried to leave clues in case something happened, and this made it all the more tragic. 2 days later, the sheriff received a reply to a telegram he had sent. The sheriff of Bell County to the north reported hearing about an individual with a similar description. This man had reportedly been seen near the town of Pineville, about 40 miles from Cumberland Gap. Local witnesses said he had stayed for a few days, working for food, but had left abruptly after a fight in a saloon. No one knew his real name, but they called him Caleb. Samuel felt a twinge of hope. Finally, he had a name, albeit possibly a fake, and a direction. He prepared to travel to Pineville, taking 2 assistants with him. The journey would take a full day on horseback, traversing mountain trails and crossing icy streams. They set out at dawn, determined to follow the trail wherever it led. Pineville was a larger town than Cumberland Gap, with a population of approximately 800. It had a main street with several shops, a small police station, and a few saloons where mine and lumber workers gathered after exhausting days. The local sheriff, a man named Frank Morrison, welcomed Samuel cordially. Frank was a Civil War veteran, with scars both visible and invisible. He remembered the man named Caleb well. Frank said Caleb had shown up in Pineville in early October, offering to do manual labor. He was strong and didn't complain about heavy tasks, so some contractors hired him temporarily. But Caleb was strange. He drank alone, avoided conversation, and occasionally had unexplained outbursts of anger. In the fight that prompted his sudden departure, he had attacked another man without clear provocation, breaking a bottle and threatening to use the shards as a weapon. Frank intervened before anything worse happened and gave Caleb a simple choice: leave town immediately or be arrested. Caleb chose to leave. Samuel asked if Frank had any idea where Caleb might have gone. Frank shook his head, but mentioned that the morning after the fight, a trader reported seeing Caleb following the trail that led south toward Harlan County. Samuel's heart sank. This confirmed the chronology. Caleb had left Pineville and headed directly toward Cumberland Gap, arriving there just a few days before Rebecca disappeared. Confirming that chronology brought a mix of relief and urgency to Sheriff Samuel Dockery. He was now certain he was on the right track, but he also understood that Caleb, if that was indeed his name, could be miles away at that moment. Samuel asked Frank Morrison if anyone in Pineville knew where Caleb had originally come from. Frank thought for a moment and then remembered a detail that might be relevant. One of the men who had worked alongside Caleb had mentioned hearing him talk to himself once, something about going back to the Virginia mountains. Virginia. The word echoed in Samuel's mind. If Caleb really was from Virginia, that complicated everything. The Kentucky-Virginia border was long and mountainous, full of isolated valleys and remote communities where a man could disappear without a trace. But Samuel couldn't simply give up. He thanked Frank for his help and decided to return to Cumberland Gap to reorganize his next steps. The return trip was made in silence. His two deputies could tell the sheriff was lost in deep thought, calculating possibilities, weighing options. Back in Cumberland Gap, Samuel found the community still reeling. Rebecca's funeral had taken place during his absence, a somber and sorrowful affair. Martha Hayes told the sheriff that over 50 people attended, and many women wept openly. Rebecca had been buried in the small churchyard, next to her husband. The simple headstone bore only her name and the years of her birth and death, 1886 to 1918, 32 years of life cut short. Samuel visited the grave alone that night. He stood there for long minutes, listening only to the wind blowing through the cypress trees surrounding the cemetery. He made a silent promise to Rebecca. He would not rest until he found the man responsible for her death. It was a matter of honor, of justice, and perhaps also of personal redemption. Samuel carried the weight of failing to protect a woman who lived alone and vulnerable in his jurisdiction. In the following days, the sheriff explored another line of inquiry. He began speaking with people familiar with the travel routes between Kentucky and Virginia. There were traveling traders, experienced trappers, and even a few smugglers who regularly passed through those mountains. One of these men, an old trapper named Elijah Stone, revealed valuable information. Elijah was 64 years old and knew the Appalachians like the back of his hand. There were official trails used by everyone, but also secret paths known only to those who had lived in those lands for generations. Elijah recounted that men fleeing the law or wanting to avoid prying eyes often used a specific trail that cut through the mountains toward Wise County, Virginia. It was a difficult route, dangerous in winter, but it shaved days off the journey for those who knew the way. Samuel asked if Elijah would agree to guide him along that trail. The old hunter hesitated. He was not young, and the journey would be strenuous. But something in Samuel's eyes, an unwavering determination, convinced Elijah to accept. They prepared to leave the next morning. Samuel chose only one helper to accompany them, a strapping young man named Daniel Perkins, who had been a miner before becoming a sheriff's deputy. They took 5 days' worth of provisions, weapons, thick blankets, and flashlights. The trail Elijah had described led through some of the wildest terrain in the Appalachians. There were no villages along the way, just raw, unforgiving wilderness. They set out at dawn on November 7th. The cold was already intense, and the first snowflakes were beginning to fall. Elijah led them along seemingly non-existent paths, narrow passages between rocks, steep descents where the horses needed to be guided with extreme care. Samuel realized that if someone truly wanted to disappear, this would be the perfect route. It was unlikely that ordinary authorities would be able to follow someone along this path. On the second day of their journey, they encountered the first signs that they were not alone in the area. Elijah pointed to the ashes of a recent fire, partially covered by leaves. Someone had camped there, probably within the last 2 weeks. Samuel examined the site carefully. There were food remains, bones of small animals, and boot prints in the damp soil. One person traveling alone. Samuel's heart raced. Could it be Caleb? They pressed on with renewed caution. Elijah warned them to be silent. If they were truly following someone dangerous, the element of surprise would be crucial. During the third day, the snow grew heavier, visibility diminished, and the cold penetrated to the bone. Daniel Perkins began to question whether they should continue, but Samuel was adamant. They had come too far to turn back now. It was late in the afternoon of that third day that they made a significant discovery. Elijah led them to a small cave he knew, a natural shelter used by hunters and travelers during storms. As they approached, they saw smoke coming from a crevice in the rocks. Someone was inside. Samuel signaled for silence. They positioned themselves strategically around the cave entrance. The sheriff took a deep breath and shouted, identifying himself as the lawful authority and ordering whoever was inside to come out with their hands visible. There was a long moment of silence. Then a husky voice answered from inside the cave. It was a male voice, tired but also defiant. The man said he had done nothing wrong and just wanted to be left alone. Samuel persisted, explaining that he needed to ask a few questions. After a few more minutes of tense negotiation, the figure slowly emerged from the cave. He was a tall man with a dark beard and dirty travel clothes. He was about 40 years old, with large calloused hands and eyes that held a mixture of weariness and something deeper, something disturbing. Samuel felt a shiver run down his spine. This man exactly matched the descriptions he'd gathered. It could very well be Caleb. The sheriff kept his hand close to his gun as he began to ask questions. What was his name? Where was he from? Where was he going? The man hesitated before answering. He said his name was Caleb Monroe, that he came from nowhere and went nowhere. He simply traveled, worked when he needed to, and moved on. Samuel watched every movement, every expression. He asked if Caleb had been to Cumberland Gap recently. The reaction was almost imperceptible, but Samuel noticed. A brief stiffening of the shoulders, a momentary averting of the gaze. Caleb denied it, saying he'd never heard of that place. Samuel then mentioned the name Rebecca Crowe. This time the reaction was clearer. Caleb clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. He asked why the sheriff was asking these questions. Samuel explained that Rebecca had been murdered and that witnesses had placed him near her property in the weeks leading up to the crime. Caleb took a step back, his expression changing from defensive to something close to panic. He began to say that he hadn't done anything, that yes, he had known Rebecca, but that he had never harmed her. The admission was enough. Samuel arrested Caleb Monroe, charging him with suspicion of murder. Caleb tried to flee, running toward the woods, but Daniel Perkins was faster. He knocked the man down with a well-aimed blow, and together they managed to immobilize him and tie his hands. Caleb screamed, protesting his innocence, but his words were lost in the icy mountain wind. Samuel knew he finally had his suspect. Now he needed to bring him back to face justice. The journey back to Cumberland Gap was slow and tense. Caleb Monroe remained tied up, riding his own horse, flanked by Samuel and Daniel. The prisoner alternated between long silences and verbal outbursts proclaiming his innocence. He said that yes, he had known Rebecca, but that he had never harmed her. Elijah Stone rode ahead, guiding the group through the treacherous trails as the snow continued to fall. The journey that had taken 3 days on the way there took 4 on the return, as they needed to be more cautious with a prisoner. During the nights they camped, Samuel kept constant vigil. He didn't trust Caleb, and he knew a desperate man was capable of anything. One night while Daniel slept and Elijah snored softly near the campfire, Caleb tried to talk to the sheriff. His voice was low, almost a whisper. He said he understood how things seemed, but that there was an explanation. Samuel replied that he would have a chance to give his version when they were back in civilization, before the appropriate authorities. Then Caleb fell silent again, staring into the dancing flames. They arrived at Cumberland Gap late in the afternoon of November 12th. News of their capture spread quickly. Residents gathered in the streets, demanding to see the man accused of killing Rebecca Crowe. Sheriff Samuel had to restrain some of the more agitated individuals who were shouting for immediate justice. He understood their anger, shared their sentiments, but he was a man of the law and believed in due process. Caleb was locked in the police station's small cell, a stone room with iron bars on the windows. Over the next few days, Samuel conducted extensive interrogations. He sat in front of the cell with pen and paper, recording every word Caleb said. The story that emerged was complex and in some ways surprising. Caleb Monroe claimed to be 39 years old, born in an isolated community in the mountains of southwestern Virginia. He had grown up in extreme poverty, the son of a miner who died when Caleb was only 15. Since then, he had lived a wandering life, working wherever he could, never settling down. Caleb admitted to having met Rebecca Crowe. He said he had shown up at her property asking for food and water, and that she had kindly offered both. He returned days later claiming to have injured his hand, and Rebecca had tended to it. Caleb confessed that he had been impressed by her kindness, something rare in his life experience, but he swore she had never caused him any harm. In fact, Caleb said with a choked voice, Rebecca reminded him of his own mother, who had died when he was young. Samuel listened attentively, but remained skeptical. He then asked about October 23rd, the day Rebecca disappeared. Where was Caleb that day? The prisoner hesitated, then said he was traveling, somewhere between Cumberland Gap and other villages. He had no proof. Samuel pressed further. What about Rebecca's diary entries, where she mentioned feeling watched, stalked? Caleb vehemently denied it. He said he had never followed her, never watched her. But there was a problem with Caleb's story. When Samuel mentioned the silver brooch he'd found in the woods, about 5 miles from Rebecca's house, Caleb paled. The sheriff noticed his reaction and pressed him. How had that brooch gotten so far? Caleb remained silent for several minutes. Then, in a barely audible voice, he said he had to tell the whole truth, but that Samuel probably wouldn't believe him. What Caleb revealed in the following hours would completely change the course of the investigation. He said that on October 23rd, he was indeed near Rebecca's property, but not with malicious intent. He was hunting in the nearby woods when he heard screams coming from the direction of the cabin, female screams, screams of terror. Caleb ran there and saw, through the window, Rebecca fighting with another man, a man Caleb didn't know but who was clearly violent in his actions. Caleb said he tried to intervene, yelling and pounding on the door, but the other man was too quick. He heard the sound of breaking glass, then all was silent. When he finally forced the door open, he found the cabin empty and clear signs of a struggle. He panicked. He knew that if he were found there, he would be immediately blamed. He was a stranger, a drifter without a reputation. He fled, but not before seeing the other man dragging something wrapped up toward the forest. Caleb followed at a distance, trying to understand what was happening. That's how, according to Caleb, he ended up near the spot where Rebecca's body would be found days later. He saw the other man leave that terrible bundle among the trees and hurriedly depart. Caleb approached, recognized it as Rebecca, and felt absolute horror. He was about to go get help when he noticed the silver brooch on the ground, partially covered by leaves. He picked it up, unsure why, perhaps as evidence, perhaps out of desperation. But then he heard voices approaching and fled again, dropping the brooch in his flight. Samuel listened to it all with an unreadable expression. It was a convenient story, almost too good. A mysterious man had appeared and disappeared, leaving Caleb as the perfect scapegoat. But there was something in the way Caleb told it, a desperate sincerity in his eyes that made Samuel hesitate. He then asked the obvious question. If Caleb was innocent and had witnessed all of this, why hadn't he immediately gone to the authorities? Why had he fled to the mountains? Caleb bowed his head. He said his entire life had been marked by injustice, that men like him, poor and rootless, were never believed. He knew he would be found guilty no matter what he said. Then he ran, hoping to reach Virginia and disappear among the mountains he had known since childhood. It was a mistake, he admitted, but a mistake born of fear and bitter experience with society. Samuel left his cell that night with his mind racing. He had a suspect in custody, evidence connecting him to the scene and the victim, but now he also had an alternative story he couldn't simply ignore. If Caleb was telling the truth, then the real killer was still at large, and that was unacceptable. The sheriff knew he needed to investigate further. He couldn't let the need to solve the case quickly blind him to other possibilities. The next morning, Samuel reconvened the men who had helped with the investigation. He told them Caleb's version, omitting some details to test their reactions. He asked if anyone else had seen strangers in the area during those critical days. At first, no one spoke up, but then a young farmer named Otto Gardner timidly raised his hand. Otto said he might have something, but wasn't sure if it was relevant. Otto recounted that on October 23rd, he was returning from a remote property where he had helped a neighbor repair a fence. It was late afternoon, almost dusk, when he passed a fork in the road that led both to Cumberland Gap and to other villages farther east. He saw a man on horseback heading east, riding quickly as if in a hurry. Otto didn't think much of it at the time, but now, listening to Caleb's story, he remembered that the man seemed agitated, nervous. Samuel asked Otto to describe the man. Otto thought carefully. He said it was hard to be sure due to the dim light, but the man appeared to be of medium build, wearing a dark hat and clothes that looked like someone with more means than a simple wanderer. It wasn't Caleb, of that Otto was certain, for the man he'd seen was less robust, thinner. Samuel felt a twinge of something that might have been hope, or might have just been more confusion. Otto Gardner's revelation opened a new crack in the investigation Samuel believed was close to completion. If there really was another man in the area that day, riding quickly away from Cumberland Gap, then Caleb Monroe's story gained unexpected credibility. The sheriff spent the next night sleepless, going over every detail, every testimony, every shred of evidence. For the first time since the beginning of that terrible case, he began to seriously consider that perhaps he had arrested the wrong man. The next morning, Samuel decided to expand his search for information. He traveled to the neighboring villages east of Cumberland Gap, following the directions Otto had mentioned. He visited small communities scattered throughout the valleys, speaking with merchants, stable owners, and tavern owners. Anyone who might have seen a lone rider hurried past in late October. Most didn't recall anything specific. These were normal days with many travelers passing through. But in a tavern in the small village of Straight Creek, Samuel found something interesting. The owner of the establishment, a portly gentleman named Augustus Finch, remembered a man who had arrived late on the night of October 23rd. Augustus remembered because the man was visibly shaken, ordered whiskey, and drank 3 shots without saying a word. He paid with silver coins and left before dawn. Augustus described the man as about 35 years old, of medium height, and dressed more refinedly than most ordinary travelers in that region. He wore a good quality wool coat and well-kept leather boots. Samuel asked if Augustus had any idea who it might be. The barkeep shook his head, but mentioned that the man had let slip a few words while drinking. Something about having no choice, and she shouldn't have found out. Augustus dismissed it at the time, thinking it was the ramblings of a drunken man, but now the words took on a sinister weight. The sheriff felt his heart race. This was no longer just a vague clue. It was becoming something concrete. Samuel returned to Cumberland Gap with renewed determination. He needed to understand who this mysterious man was and what his connection to Rebecca Crowe might be. He began investigating the weeks leading up to the murder even more carefully. He spoke again with Martha Hayes, Rebecca's neighbor, asking if Rebecca had mentioned discovering anything unusual or disturbing. Martha thought for a long time and then remembered something that had seemed insignificant. About 3 weeks before her death, Rebecca had mentioned to Martha that she'd found something strange while gathering medicinal herbs near her property. She said she'd stumbled upon objects buried shallowly in the woods, things that appeared to have been hidden there on purpose. Martha had asked what they were, and Rebecca had responded vaguely, saying only that they looked like someone's belongings, perhaps stolen. Rebecca planned to mention this to the sheriff, but Martha wasn't sure if she had. Samuel searched his records, but found no mention of Rebecca contacting him about hidden objects. This meant she might have investigated on her own, or worse, confronted someone directly. The sheriff again gathered a group of men and returned to Rebecca's property. This time the search would be even more thorough, focusing on the wooded areas where Rebecca usually gathered her herbs. It took nearly 2 days of systematic searching before they found anything. William Porter, whose hunting eye was invaluable, spotted an area where the earth appeared to have been disturbed and then disguised with leaves and twigs. They began digging carefully. A few feet deep, they found a canvas bag containing several objects. There were pocket watches, some modest jewelry, gold and silver coins, and documents identifying the original owners. Samuel examined the documents with growing understanding. They were stolen goods, no doubt, and the names on the papers belonged to people living in different parts of the county and neighboring counties. Petty thefts that might never have been connected, but now revealed a pattern. Someone was operating in this area, stealing discreetly from various people over the course of months, perhaps years, and Rebecca, by pure chance, had discovered the hiding place. The sheriff returned to the station and began cross-referencing information. Who would have access to the area? Who could move between different communities without arousing suspicion? Who would have enough knowledge of the area to choose that specific location as a hideout? The answer, when it finally emerged from the data, was shocking and unexpected. There were only a few people who fit that profile, and one of them was someone respected in the community. Samuel felt the weight of that revelation like a stone in his stomach. If his deduction was correct, then Rebecca's killer wasn't a stranger, not a rootless drifter. He was someone everyone knew, someone they trusted, and that made it all the more disturbing. The sheriff knew he needed more evidence before acting. Accusing someone prominent without solid proof would be disastrous. He spent the next few days discreetly investigating. He spoke to merchants about unusual transactions, to neighbors about strange movements, to anyone who could provide additional pieces of this macabre puzzle, and slowly, meticulously, the complete picture began to form. There was a man who frequently traveled between communities in the region for professional reasons, a man who had detailed knowledge of the Appalachians and the people who lived there, a man who appeared respectable, but who, Samuel now discovered, had secret gambling debts. The name that emerged from the shadows was Lawrence Pritchard. Lawrence was 37 years old and worked as a traveling agent, buying furs and timber from small producers to resell in larger cities. He was married, lived in a modest but comfortable home on the outskirts of Cumberland Gap, and was known by all as a hard-working and trustworthy man. No one would suspect him, and perhaps that was precisely why he had managed to operate for so long undetected. Samuel knew he needed a confession or irrefutable evidence. He decided to take a cautious approach. He invited Lawrence to the police station for an informal chat, claiming he needed information about trade routes in the region. Lawrence accepted without hesitation, seemingly without any concern. He arrived on the appointed morning, greeted the sheriff cordially, and sat comfortably in the offered chair. Samuel began with general questions, establishing a casual tone. They talked about business, the hardships of the approaching winter, and the tragedy that had struck the community with the death of Rebecca Crowe. It was when he mentioned Rebecca that Samuel noticed his first reaction, a brief stiffening of Lawrence's shoulders, an almost imperceptible change in his breathing. The sheriff continued, seemingly unconcerned, mentioning that the investigation had revealed surprising aspects of the case. Then, without warning, Samuel placed on the table some of the objects found buried in the forest: watches, coins, documents. He watched Lawrence's reaction closely. The man paled visibly. His eyes widened for a split second before he tried to compose himself. Samuel calmly asked if Lawrence recognized the objects. Lawrence stammered, saying no, that he'd never seen them before, but his voice betrayed a nervousness he couldn't hide. Samuel then revealed his knowledge of Lawrence's gambling debts, his frequent travels, the fact that he had both the opportunity and the motive to commit the petty thefts. And finally, the testimony of Augustus Finch, who had described a man who exactly matched Lawrence's appearance, arriving agitated at Straight Creek on the night of October 23rd. The web was tightening, and Lawrence sensed it. The silence that followed was thick, charged with tension. Lawrence stared at his hands, trembling slightly. Samuel remained motionless, waiting. He knew this was the crucial moment. Finally, after what felt like hours but were only minutes, Lawrence began to speak. His voice was low, defeated. He said he had never wanted any of this to happen, that he had started with petty thefts just to pay off debts, and that he planned to return everything eventually. But Rebecca had discovered the hiding place. Lawrence Pritchard's words came slowly, carrying a weight that seemed to crush his spirit. Samuel Dockery remained silent, letting the man continue, knowing that any interruption could shatter this fragile moment of confession. Lawrence explained that Rebecca had come to him a few days after finding the buried objects. She hadn't gone directly to the sheriff, as Lawrence had feared. Instead, compassionate in nature, she decided to give him a chance to explain. She confronted him in his own home, while his wife was visiting relatives in another village. Rebecca had told Lawrence that she recognized some of the objects, that she knew they belonged to locals. She asked if he was in trouble, if he needed help. She offered to keep it a secret if he returned everything and changed his path. Lawrence remembered the kindness in her eyes, the genuine concern in her voice. But he also knew that his reputation, his marriage, his entire life would be destroyed if this became known. He asked for time to think, and Rebecca agreed to give him a few days before making any decisions. But those days were torment for Lawrence. He couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Anxiety consumed him. He thought constantly about Rebecca, about the power she held over his future, and slowly, a dark idea began to form in his troubled mind. If Rebecca disappeared, the secret would disappear with her. No one else knew about the hidden objects. He could retrieve them, destroy them, or return them anonymously and go on with his life as if nothing had happened. Lawrence paused, wiping away tears that were beginning to stream down his face. Samuel remained impassive, though inside he felt a mixture of anger and sadness. Lawrence continued, saying that on October 23rd, he went to Rebecca's cabin late in the afternoon. He had brought a prepared story about wanting to discuss the terms of the return of the objects. Rebecca welcomed him, confident they were doing the right thing. But when they entered the house, something inside Lawrence snapped. The fear, the despair, the feeling of being trapped transformed into something dark and uncontrollable. What happened in that cabin, Lawrence described in a broken voice, was the result of panic and desperation. He said he hadn't planned to harm Rebecca, but when she again mentioned the possibility of going to the authorities if he didn't act quickly, something in him reacted violently. There was an argument, then a struggle. Rebecca tried to defend herself, but Lawrence was stronger. When the confusion finally subsided and Lawrence regained some lucidity, he understood the terrible extent of what he had done. He was in absolute panic. He couldn't think clearly. He only knew he needed to hide what had happened. He wrapped Rebecca's body in a blanket he found in the house, carried her to his horse, which was waiting hidden among the trees, and rode into the forest. He knew the land well from his work. He chose a remote spot where he believed no one would find anything for a long time. Then he returned to the cabin and tried to make it look like Rebecca had simply disappeared, but Lawrence hadn't counted on someone seeing him. Caleb Monroe had been in the nearby woods, as he claimed, and had witnessed some of those terrible events. Lawrence said he only realized the presence of another person as he was leaving the body in the woods. He saw a shadow among the trees, panicked again, and quickly fled. He rode for hours until he reached Straight Creek, where he tried to calm his nerves with whiskey before finally returning home in the early hours of the next morning. In the days that followed, Lawrence lived in a constant state of terror. When the search for Rebecca began, he joined the search parties, feigning concern and sympathy. When her body was found, he expressed shock and outrage along with everyone else. And when Caleb Monroe was captured and arrested, Lawrence felt a terrible, shameful relief. A rootless stranger was being blamed for the crime he had committed. Justice would take its course, and Lawrence would be free. But his conscience wouldn't leave him alone. Nights were tormented by nightmares where he saw Rebecca's face, where he heard her gentle voice offering help. During the day, he avoided people's eyes, especially Martha Hayes, who had been Rebecca's friend. His wife had noticed changes in him, asked if he was sick. Lawrence made excuses about business worries, about the approaching difficult winter, but inside, he was slowly disintegrating. Samuel had listened in silence. When Lawrence finally finished his confession, the sheriff felt a complex mix of emotions. There was satisfaction at having discovered the truth, but also profound sadness at the unnecessary tragedy of it all. Rebecca Crowe had died simply for doing the right thing, for trying to help someone in need, and a man everyone considered respectable had shown himself capable of terrible acts when pressured by fear and selfishness. Samuel slowly rose and called Daniel Perkins, who was waiting outside. Together they placed Lawrence Pritchard in formal custody. There was no resistance. Lawrence seemed almost relieved to finally have confessed, to no longer have to carry the burden alone. He was taken to the cell adjacent to the one where Caleb Monroe still waited. When the two men saw each other through the bars, there was an awkward moment of mutual recognition. Caleb realized he had finally been vindicated, and Lawrence saw in the other man's face the reflection of his own ruined fate. Sheriff Samuel immediately prepared the papers to release Caleb Monroe. He formally apologized for the mistake, though he explained that it had been necessary to investigate all possibilities. Caleb accepted the apology with quiet dignity. He was free, but those weeks of arrest and prosecution had left their mark. He asked the sheriff what he would do now. Samuel offered him some coins as compensation and suggested he remain in the area for a few days, until the entire situation was officially resolved. Caleb agreed, but they both knew he would likely be leaving soon. Men like Caleb never stayed in one place for long. The news of Lawrence Pritchard's arrest shocked Cumberland Gap even more deeply than Rebecca's death. People couldn't believe that a man they knew, did business with, and greeted on the street could have committed such a horrific act. Lawrence's wife, Emily, was devastated. She had abandoned everything and gone to live temporarily with distant relatives, unable to face the stares and whispers of the community. Some pitied her, others blamed her for not realizing what her husband was hiding. Samuel knew his work was not yet complete. He needed to ensure that Lawrence faced a proper trial, that the stolen objects were returned to their rightful owners, and that Rebecca Crowe's memory was properly honored. He visited her grave again, this time with the bitter satisfaction of being able to report, even if only in thought, that justice had been served. Rebecca had not died in vain. Her discovery of the stolen objects, her attempt to do good, had ultimately led to the exposure of a criminal. Martha Hayes organized a vigil in Rebecca's memory. Dozens of people attended, lighting candles and sharing stories of her kindness. They spoke of how Rebecca had always helped the sick, how she never refused help to anyone in need. The local church's reverend offered a prayer, asking that Rebecca's soul find eternal peace, and that the community would learn from this tragedy the importance of appreciating good people while they were still around. Lawrence Pritchard's trial was set for early December 1918. The Harlan County Courthouse, a modest red-brick building in the center of the nearest town, prepared to hear the case that had shaken the entire Appalachian region of Kentucky. News had spread beyond the county lines, and newspapers from larger cities sent correspondents to cover what they called the case of the kind woman and the treacherous merchant. Samuel Dockery spent weeks organizing evidence, preparing witnesses, and ensuring that nothing was left to chance. The judge assigned to the case was Harrison Blackwell, a 63-year veteran known for his seriousness and impartiality. Blackwell had served on the bench for over 25 years and had seen countless cases, but even he admitted that this one had particularly disturbing elements. The combination of betrayed trust, punished kindness, and revealed secrets created a narrative that touched something deep within the community's collective consciousness. The first day of the trial drew a crowd. The courtroom was packed, with people standing along the walls and others outside, waiting for any scrap of information. Lawrence Pritchard was brought in under escort, dressed simply and with a defeated expression. His eyes avoided contact with anyone in the room. When Judge Blackwell entered, everyone stood respectfully, and the silence that fell over the courtroom was almost physical in its density. The prosecution was presented by the county prosecutor, a competent attorney named Theodore Walsh. Walsh was 42 years old and had a reputation for meticulous preparation. He outlined the case with methodical clarity, describing how Rebecca Crowe had discovered the stolen items, how she had confronted Lawrence, offering him a chance for redemption, and how this kindness had been rewarded with betrayal and violence. Walsh presented Rebecca's diary, the items recovered from the woods, and Sheriff Samuel's detailed testimony about Lawrence's full confession. Lawrence's defense was taken over by court-appointed attorney Martin Crawford, a younger man with little experience in serious criminal cases. Crawford did his best, arguing that Lawrence had acted in a moment of extreme panic and mental disturbance, that there had been no premeditation, and that his client had shown genuine remorse in confessing. But even Crawford seemed to understand that he was fighting a virtually losing battle. The evidence was overwhelming, and the confession eliminated any reasonable doubt. Witnesses were called one by one. Martha Hayes took the stand with sad dignity, describing Rebecca as a woman of incomparable kindness. Her testimony moved many present, and some women in the audience wept openly. Thomas Wiggins, the grocer, confirmed the concerns Rebecca had expressed in the weeks before her death. Otto Gardner reported seeing a man riding hurriedly east on the fateful day and identified Lawrence as fitting that description. Augustus Finch, the Straight Creek tavern keeper, traveled to the court to testify about Lawrence's arrival that night of October 23rd. He described the man's agitated state, the rapidly consumed shots of whiskey, and the muttered words about having no choice. William Porter was called to describe the discovery of the brooch and later the buried objects. Dr. Henry Caldwell presented his medical findings, technically but respectfully describing the physical evidence that corroborated the prosecution's version. And then Caleb Monroe was called to testify. There were murmurs in the room when he entered. Many still viewed him with suspicion, associating him with the days when he had been the prime suspect. But Caleb stood his ground, calmly describing what he had witnessed on that terrible day. He confirmed hearing screams trying to intervene and seeing Lawrence dragging something from the cabin toward the woods. His testimony, combined with all the others, created an irrefutable picture of the sequence of events. Throughout the trial, Lawrence remained crestfallen. When he was finally called to make his closing statements, he rose slowly. His voice was weak, choked. He apologized to the memory of Rebecca Crowe, to the community he had betrayed, and especially to his wife Emily, who had not attended the trial, but whose absence was felt like a ghostly presence. Lawrence said he expected no forgiveness, that he understood the gravity of what he had done, and that he would accept any punishment imposed. You didn't try to justify yourself or minimize your actions. It was, in a way, the only dignity he had left. The jury, composed of 12 local men, deliberated for less than 2 hours. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous: guilty of murder. Judge Blackwell received the verdict with a grave expression and scheduled sentencing for the following day. That night, Cumberland Gap and the surrounding communities waited in tense silence, knowing the outcome was near. The next morning, the court reconvened. Judge Blackwell delivered his sentence in a firm, clear voice. Lawrence Pritchard was sentenced to the maximum penalty allowed by law, hanging. The execution would take place in the county jail on a date to be determined, but not for 30 days, allowing time for appeals. Lawrence received the sentence without any visible reaction. It was as if he had already resigned himself to his fate from the moment he confessed to Sheriff Samuel. The community received the verdict with mixed emotions. There was satisfaction at seeing justice served, but also sadness at the tragic nature of the entire situation. Rebecca Crowe would not return, and Lawrence Pritchard, despite his guilt, had been a respected member of that society until his secrets were revealed. It was a disturbing reminder that evil can exist beneath masks of respectability, and that moments of moral weakness can lead to irreversible consequences. Samuel Dockery felt the weight of responsibility begin to lift slightly. He had done his job, conducted the investigation diligently, corrected his initial mistake in arresting Caleb, and ensured that the true culprit faced justice. But there was no triumph in his heart, only profound weariness and melancholy. Cases like this reminded him that the law could punish crimes, but it could not undo them, could not restore lost lives or destroyed innocence. Caleb Monroe left the area a few days after the trial. Samuel met him on the morning of his departure, preparing his horse for the long journey back to the Virginia mountains. The two men exchanged few words, but there was a mutual understanding between them. Caleb thanked the sheriff for finally believing him and working tirelessly to uncover the truth. Samuel wished him good luck and safety on his travels. He watched as Caleb rode away, gradually disappearing into the trees that were beginning to lose their last autumn leaves. Lawrence Pritchard's execution took place on a cold January morning in 1919. It was a somber event, attended only by the necessary authorities and a few official witnesses. Lawrence faced his end with the same resignation he had demonstrated since his confession. His last words were a silent prayer and a final plea for forgiveness from all he had harmed. When it was over, his body was handed over to distant relatives who took it for burial away from Cumberland Gap in an undisclosed location to avoid disturbances. Emily Pritchard never returned to the area. It was rumored that she had changed her surname and started a new life in another state, trying to escape the shadows of her past. No one blamed her. She too, in her own way, had been a victim of secrets her husband had kept hidden until they exploded into tragedy. The house where the couple had lived sat abandoned for months before being sold to a family from another region, unaware of the dark history associated with the place. The months following Lawrence Pritchard's execution brought an eerie stillness to Cumberland Gap and the surrounding communities in Kentucky's Appalachian mountains. It was as if the entire region needed time to process everything that had happened, to absorb the painful lessons of that tragedy, and find a way to move forward. The winter of 1919 was particularly harsh, with intense snowfall and temperatures dropping below freezing, 0 degrees Fahrenheit. People remained in their homes, warming themselves by their fireplaces, and reflecting on the fragility of life and the bonds of trust that held their communities together. Martha Hayes took responsibility for caring for Rebecca Crowe's property. The small cabin had been sealed after the investigation, but Martha felt she couldn't simply leave it abandoned. With Sheriff Samuel's permission, She began sorting through her late friend's belongings. She found carefully stored letters, yellowed photographs of Rebecca with her husband, and handwritten prescriptions for remedies that had helped so many over the years. Martha decided to donate the clothes to families in need, but kept a few personal items as a reminder of the extraordinary woman Rebecca had been. Among her belongings, Martha discovered something that touched her heart deeply. It was a small carved wooden box, hidden in the back of a closet. Inside was a collection of letters Rebecca had never sent, written to her deceased husband as a way to keep her connection with him alive. In the letters, Rebecca expressed hope for the future, spoke of her loneliness, but also of her determination to live with purpose and kindness. The last letter was dated just a week before her death. Rebecca had written about feeling that her life had meaning because she could help others, even in small ways. Martha took these letters to the reverend of the local church, who read them during a sermon dedicated to Rebecca's memory. Many wept as they heard the words of the woman they had known and respected. The reverend spoke of how Rebecca represented the best of human nature, the willingness to see goodness in others and offer help without expecting recompense, and how that same kindness, tragically, had made her vulnerable to someone who had chosen the path of moral darkness. Sheriff Samuel Dockery found himself changed by the experience of that case. He had served 12 years as sheriff, dealing with countless situations, but none had affected him as deeply as Rebecca Crowe's death. The investigation had taught him important lessons about not accepting easy explanations, about the importance of following evidence, even when it contradicted his initial conclusions, and about how seemingly respectable people could hide terrible secrets. Samuel became more vigilant, more alert to the subtle signs that something might be amiss in his community. He also developed a different relationship with the community itself. People began to see him not just as an authority figure, but as someone genuinely committed to justice and truth. Samuel began holding monthly open meetings where anyone could bring concerns or report suspicious situations. He encouraged residents to care for one another, especially those living alone or in vulnerable situations. Rebecca's death would not have been in vain if it served to strengthen the bonds of mutual protection in that community. The stolen objects that Lawrence Pritchard had hidden were all returned to their rightful owners. Some had forgotten the items were missing, as they were small things missing for so long that they had stopped looking. Others were thrilled to recover family clocks, inherited brooches, and cherished coins. Each return was a small act of restoration, an attempt to repair some of the damage caused by Lawrence's crimes. Spring eventually arrived, bringing with it the melting snows and the rebirth of mountain life. Trees sprouted new growth, streams flowed freely, and birds returned from their winter migrations. Cumberland Gap slowly began to regain some semblance of normalcy. New stories began to circulate. New events filled the conversations in grocers and taverns, but Rebecca Crowe was not forgotten. Martha Hayes, along with other community members, organized the creation of a small memorial in the cemetery where Rebecca was buried. They raised funds to replace the simple headstone with a more elaborate one, bearing an inscription that read, "Rebecca Crowe, 1886 to 1918, a woman of incomparable kindness who dedicated her life to helping others. Her memory will live on as a light in the shadows of Appalachia." Around the grave, they planted wildflowers that Rebecca had often gathered for her medicine. The following spring, those flowers bloomed profusely, creating a small garden of beauty and remembrance. Samuel visited the grave occasionally, especially when he faced difficult decisions or complex cases. Somehow the quiet presence of the place helped him think clearly, to remember why he had chosen to serve the law. On one such visit, he found Caleb Monroe standing before the grave. It was a surprise, as Samuel had assumed Caleb would never return to that area. The two men greeted each other with silent nods. Caleb explained that he was just passing through, traveling west this time, but had felt the need to stop and pay his last respects to Rebecca. He said the whole experience had changed him in ways he was still trying to comprehend. For the first time in his life, he felt part of something bigger, connected to a community, even if only briefly. The justice served in Rebecca's name had restored some of his faith in humanity, a faith that years of hard living on the road had nearly destroyed. Samuel asked where Caleb was going. The wanderer smiled slightly and said he didn't know for sure. Perhaps to the plains, perhaps to the mountains farther west, wherever the road took him. But he promised he would carry with him the memory of those days in the Kentucky Appalachians, the memory of a kind woman and a sheriff determined to do the right thing. The two men parted again, this time with a firm handshake and a mutual understanding that transcended words. As the months passed, new people arrived in Cumberland Gap and neighboring communities. Some came to seek work in the still operating mines, others to farm the fertile valleys. To these people, Rebecca Crowe was just a name on a tombstone, a tragic story told by older residents. But to those who knew her, who witnessed the events of that dark autumn of 1918, she remained vivid in their memories as an example of kindness and a reminder of the dangers that lurk when secrets and despair combine. Rebecca's cabin was eventually occupied by a young family who had moved to the area. Martha Hayes made a point of telling them the history of the place, not to frighten them, but to honor the memory of those who had lived there before. The new family, moved by the story, maintained the small herb garden Rebecca had cultivated and continued the tradition of helping neighbors when needed. It was a small but meaningful way to keep alive the spirit of the woman who had transformed the property into a place of healing and kindness. Dr. Henry Caldwell, who had examined Rebecca's body and testified at the trial, began training young people interested in basic medicine and herbal treatments. He said he did this in honor of Rebecca, whose knowledge and generosity had helped so many over the years. Several young people from the area, both men and women, participated in these trainings, learning not only medical techniques, but also the importance of using knowledge to serve the community. The following years brought inevitable changes to the Kentucky Appalachians. World War I finally ended, and soldiers returned to their mountain homes, bringing with them stories of distant lands and the horrors they had witnessed. The world seemed different, faster paced, more connected. Roads were improved, telephone lines began to be installed even in the most remote regions, and life that had previously seemed isolated from the rest of the country gradually integrated into the inexorably advancing modernity. But even with all these transformations, Rebecca Crowe's story remained etched in the collective consciousness of that region. It became one of the defining narratives of Cumberland Gap, told and retold over the decades, each generation adding its own interpretations and lessons. For some, it was a story about the dangers of naive kindness in a world that doesn't always reward virtue. For others, it was a reminder that secrets don't stay buried forever, that the truth eventually emerges from the shadows, no matter how deep. Sheriff Samuel Dockery served his community for another 15 years after the events of 1918. He retired in 1933, his hair completely white and his body weary from decades of service. At his farewell ceremony, he spoke briefly about the cases that marked his career and inevitably mentioned Rebecca Crowe. He said that investigation had taught him that justice is not just about punishing the guilty, but about honoring victims, about ensuring their stories are told truthfully and respectfully. The audience listened in respectful silence, many still vividly remembering those dark autumn days. Martha Hayes lived to be 87, passing away in 1952. Throughout her life, she kept the memory of her friend Rebecca alive. She visited the grave weekly, kept the flowers planted around it well tended, and told stories about Rebecca to anyone who showed an interest. In the last years of her life, Martha wrote her memoirs in a simple notebook, dedicating several pages to the friendship she had shared with Rebecca and the tragic events that took her life. That notebook was preserved by the family and eventually donated to the local historical society. The property where Rebecca had lived changed hands several times over the decades. Each new family that settled there heard the story, and many reported feeling a peaceful presence there, as if Rebecca's kind spirit still permeated the land. The medicinal herb garden continued to be maintained for generations, becoming a small local tradition. Locals still sought out those specific plants when they needed natural remedies, unknowingly honoring the legacy of the woman who first cultivated them there. The cemetery where Rebecca was buried expanded over the years, accommodating new generations of Cumberland Gap residents. But her grave, with its ever-blooming wildflowers in spring and summer, remained one of the most visited. It became customary among locals to stop there when visiting other graves, leave a fresh flower, and say a short prayer. Even those who never knew her felt a connection to her story, to what it represented about light and darkness, kindness and betrayal, justice and memory. Caleb Monroe was never seen in the area again after that final visit to Rebecca's grave. Occasional rumors surfaced over the years about a lone wanderer in the mountains further west who matched his description, but nothing was confirmed. Perhaps he finally found a place to settle, or perhaps he continued his nomadic life until the end of his days. Either way, his role in the story remained significant. It was the accidental testimony that eventually helped reveal the truth, and his wrongful arrest served as a catalyst for Sheriff Samuel to investigate further, leading to the discovery of the true culprit. Lawrence Pritchard was quickly forgotten by most. His name was rarely mentioned, and when it was accompanied by expressions of disgust and sadness. His story served as a cautionary tale about how financial pressures, poor choices, and panic can transform an ordinary person into someone capable of terrible acts. It also raised questions about how many other Lawrence Pritchards existed in the world, people living seemingly respectable lives while harboring secrets that, if exposed, would reveal very different natures. Rebecca Crowe's headstone has withstood the test of time, weathering the harsh Appalachian winters and the hot summers. The inscription remained legible for decades, reminding all who passed by of the woman of incomparable kindness who dedicated her life to helping others. In 1968, when the Harlan County Historical Society began cataloging significant events and figures in the region, Rebecca Crowe was singled out for special mention. Her story was documented in detail, drawing on official court records, Martha Hayes's memoirs, and the meticulous reports Sheriff Samuel had filed. Today, more than a century after those disturbing events, Rebecca Crowe's story still resonates. Appalachia has changed immensely since 1918. The coal mines that once sustained the local economy have largely closed. Modern roads cut through the mountains, connecting communities that were once isolated. Technology has completely transformed the way people live and communicate, but the lessons of that story remain relevant. Kindness can still be exploited by those with dark intentions. Secrets still corrode the integrity of individuals and communities, and the pursuit of justice still requires determination, the courage to question initial assumptions, and an unwavering commitment to the truth. Rebecca Crowe, that simple woman who lived alone in a mountain cabin, who helped neighbors with medicinal herbs, and who offered kindness even to strangers, has become a symbol of something greater than her own life. She represents the light that can exist even in the most difficult places, and the terrible price that light sometimes pays when darkness approaches. The Kentucky Appalachians hold many stories in their ancient mountains, their deep valleys, and their dense forests. Stories of courageous pioneers, of forgotten battles, of lost loves and heroic victories. But few of these stories carry the emotional and moral weight of Rebecca Crowe's case. It's a narrative that forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature, about how circumstances can bring out the best and worst within us. And so as the wind blows through the cypress trees of the small Cumberland Gap Cemetery and the wildflowers gently sway around a particular headstone, it's as if Appalachia is whispering its own version of that story. A story that began with kindness, traversed unimaginable darkness, and ended with belated but necessary justice. A story that reminds us that even in the deepest shadows of human nature, truth eventually finds its way to the light. If this story touched you in any way, if these words sparked reflections on kindness, justice, or the complexity of human nature, please leave a like. Subscribing to the channel helps us continue to bring these forgotten narratives of American history to life, these voices silenced by time that deserve to be heard again. Share your thoughts on this case in the comments. Tell us if you know of similar stories from your own region, or simply share your thoughts on how Rebecca Crowe's story resonates with you. Each interaction strengthens our community of people fascinated by the dark mysteries that shaped the past and continue to teach us about the present. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the Appalachians of 1918, and until the next story emerges from the shadows of time.